April 11, 1945, the crumbling town of Eisenach, Germany. As dawn broke over the Thuringian forest, Hauptmann Werner Kluge of the 11th Panzer Division stood atop a hastily fortified schoolhouse, scanning the horizon with his binoculars for the American advance he knew was coming. The Germans had prepared the townspeople, especially the children, with stories of the barbaric black American soldiers they called Schwarze Teufel, Black Devils, who would surely bring destruction upon their homeland. Little did Kluge know that within weeks, those very same German children would be running toward, not away from, these soldiers their propaganda had demonized. Before we dive into this story, drop a quick hi in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. This is the story of how the reality of human compassion shattered years of hateful propaganda, and how hungry children discovered that the devils they had been taught to fear would become their unexpected salvation in Germany's darkest hour. The winter of 1944-45 had been particularly brutal for the German civilian population. Food rationing had reached catastrophic levels, with most families subsisting on less than 1,000 calories per day. In the small town of Eisenach, nestled against the rolling Thuringian hills about 150 miles southwest of Berlin, 12-year-old Greta Schmidt had grown accustomed to the constant gnawing hunger that had become her daily companion. Her father, a Wehrmacht officer, had not been heard from for months since the fighting on the Eastern Front, and her mother struggled to feed Greta and her two younger brothers on the meager rations allocated to them. "We must be strong," Frau Schmidt would tell her children each night as she divided their dinner, often just a thin potato soup with a small piece of dark bread. "The Führer has promised that victory is near. We must endure just a little longer." But even as a child, Greta could see the worry in her mother's eyes. The air raid sirens wailed almost nightly now, and rumors spread through the town like wildfire. The Americans were coming from the west, the Russians from the east, and worse, according to Herr Müller, the Nazi Party local leader. Among the American forces were regiments of black soldiers who had been specially selected for their brutality. "They are not like us," Müller had announced at the mandatory town meeting the previous Sunday. "These Negroes are barely human. Savages brought from the jungles of Africa to destroy German civilization. They have been promised German women and children as rewards for their advance. You must hide your families when they come." At school, Greta and her classmates were shown illustrations depicting black American soldiers as ape-like monsters with exaggerated features. Her teacher, Fräulein Hoffmann, distributed pamphlets explaining that these Schwarze Teufel, or black devils, were the products of American race mixing and moral degradation. One particularly disturbing image showed a hulking simian figure in an American uniform carrying off a screaming German child. "This is why we fight," Fräulein Hoffmann had said solemnly, "to protect German blood and German children from these beasts." Despite her youth, Greta had felt uncomfortable with these lessons. Her father, before leaving for the front, had been a history professor at the university in Jena. In their home had been books, now hidden away with different ideas about the world. Once, finding her looking at an old atlas, her father had pointed to the varied countries of Africa and told her about ancient kingdoms and great civilizations there. But she dared not question the official lessons now. Too many families had been visited by the Gestapo after their children repeated the wrong things at school. Meanwhile, approximately 60 miles to the southwest, Staff Sergeant James Wilson of the 761st Tank Battalion, the famed Black Panthers, sat atop his Sherman tank nicknamed Lucille after his wife back in Harlem. The 761st was one of the few all-black combat units in the segregated U.S. Army, finally committed to battle after years of training and fighting prejudice within their own military. Despite their proven combat effectiveness since landing in France, they continued to face discrimination even while fighting Nazism. "Mail call!" shouted Corporal Henry Davis, tossing a letter up to Wilson. It was from his wife, containing a newspaper clipping about racial tensions back home and a photograph of their 4-year-old daughter. "Any news from the world of democracy we're supposedly fighting for?" asked Lieutenant William Peterson, the company's white commanding officer, with a hint of irony that had become common in their interactions. Wilson folded the letter carefully. "Race riot in Philadelphia. 2 dead. My wife says our neighbor got beat up just for trying to get a factory job. Peterson nodded grimly. The contradiction was never far from their minds, fighting against Nazi racial ideology while serving in a segregated army for a country that still enforced Jim Crow laws. Many of the men carried a pocket-sized copy of the U.S. Constitution along with their dog tags, a pointed reminder of the promise of equality they were still waiting to be fulfilled. "We move out at 500, Peterson said, changing the subject. "Intelligence says we'll be hitting German towns starting tomorrow. Patton wants us to maintain the momentum." General George Patton had initially resisted using black tank units, but after seeing the 761st in action, he'd famously told them, "Men, you're the first Negro tankers to ever fight in the American Army. I would never have asked for you if you weren't good. I have nothing but the best in my army." Despite this backhanded compliment, the unit had proven themselves repeatedly, fighting through France and into Germany with distinction. As they prepared for the push eastward, Private Marcus Johnson, the youngest member of Wilson's crew at just 19, approached his sergeant with concern. "Sarge, the fella's been talking. We heard the Germans been telling stories about us to their people, saying we're cannibals and all sorts of crazy things." Wilson nodded. Intelligence briefings had included captured Nazi propaganda depicting black soldiers as subhuman monsters. "That's their fear talking, Johnson. They're trying to scare their own people into fighting harder. But you know what? When they actually meet us, that's when their lies fall apart." Johnson wasn't so sure. "But what if the civilians attack us? What if they're all fanatics?" "We follow the rules of engagement," Wilson said firmly. "We're soldiers of the United States Army, not the monsters they make us out to be. That's how we win, not just the war, but something bigger." That night, as both the American soldiers and the German civilians prepared for their inevitable encounter, two worlds built on entirely different understandings of each other moved inexorably closer. In Eisenach, emergency preparations accelerated. The remaining men, mostly boys too young or men too old for military service, were organized into Volkssturm units, a last-ditch civilian militia. They were issued a motley collection of weapons: hunting rifles, World War I-era Mausers, even some Polish and Czech firearms captured earlier in the war. Greta watched as Herr Fischer, the 68-year-old baker who had always given her extra bread before the war, awkwardly practiced with an antique rifle in the town square. "The Volkssturm will protect us until the Wehrmacht reinforcements arrive," announced Ortsgruppenleiter Müller, though few believed him anymore. The promised wonder weapons that would turn the tide of war had not materialized. Instead, the sound of distant artillery grew closer each day. Greta's mother had been assigned to help convert the town's Rathaus, town hall, into an emergency hospital. Returning home after a long day of moving furniture and setting up cots, she gathered her children around the kitchen table. "Listen carefully," she said, her voice low and urgent. "When the fighting starts, we will go to the cellar. You will not leave, no matter what you hear. If I am not with you, Greta, you are in charge of your brothers. If strangers come, any strangers, you hide behind the false wall where we keep Vater's books. Understand?" The children nodded solemnly. 10-year-old Heinrich asked, "Even if they're German soldiers?" Their mother hesitated. Reports of German soldiers looting and punishing defeatists in other towns had reached them. "Yes," she finally said, "even then. We trust no one until this madness ends." That night, the distant rumble of artillery seemed closer than ever. Greta lay awake, listening to her mother packing a small suitcase with their most important possessions: family photographs, her wedding ring, a few pieces of silver that had belonged to her grandmother, documents proving their identity. The official instructions were not to flee. That evacuation would be organized if necessary, but fewer people believed the official pronouncements with each passing day. As dawn broke on April 12th, the Americans began their advance toward Eisenach and surrounding villages. The 761st Tank Battalion, attached to the 71st Infantry Division for this operation, formed the spearhead. Their orders were to secure key road junctions and clear the way for the infantry following behind. Inside his Sherman tank, Staff Sergeant Wilson peered through the periscope at the rolling German countryside. Despite the war's destruction, spring was asserting itself. Green buds on trees, wildflowers emerging in fields. It seemed obscene that such beauty could exist alongside such human suffering. 500 yards to the village, reported Corporal Davis, who was driving. No movement visible? Maintain speed, Wilson ordered. Johnson, keep your eyes on those woods to the right. Peterson said there might be Panzerfaust teams hiding there. The German handheld anti-tank weapons had proven deadly against Sherman tanks at close range. As they approached the first outlying farms, Wilson observed an eerie stillness. No civilians, no livestock in the fields. Then suddenly a white bedsheet appeared, hanging from the window of a farmhouse. "Hold position," Wilson ordered, bringing the small column of 3 tanks to a halt. This could be a trap. The 761st had encountered such deceptions before. Lieutenant Peterson, commanding the 2nd tank, radioed, "Proceeding on foot to investigate, cover me." They watched tensely as Peterson, pistol drawn, approached the farmhouse. An elderly man emerged, hands raised high. After a brief conversation, Peterson waved the all-clear signal. "He says the Wehrmacht pulled out last night," Peterson reported upon returning. "Most of the Nazi officials fled too. There's just Volkssturm left in the town ahead, old men and boys. He thinks they'll surrender rather than fight." Wilson wasn't convinced. "The diehards are the most dangerous. Keep alert." As they resumed their advance toward Eisenach proper, the quiet was shattered by a single shot, a sniper round that pinged harmlessly off their armor. Immediately, the gunner, Specialist Robert Taylor, swiveled the tank's .50 caliber machine gun toward the source of fire, the steeple of a small church ahead. "Hold fire," Wilson commanded. "That's a church. Could be civilians in there." Instead, Wilson radioed for infantry support. A squad from the 71st Division moved up and cleared the church, finding a single teenage boy with a hunting rifle, trembling in fear. When asked where the rest of the defenders were, he pointed toward the town center. The Americans proceeded cautiously. Intelligence had warned them about 2 particular dangers in these final pushes into German territory: fanatical last stands by SS units or Hitler Youth, and booby traps left in abandoned positions. But as they entered the outskirts of Eisenach, what they encountered instead was a populace paralyzed by fear, doors and windows shut tight, streets deserted except for a few white surrender flags hanging limply in the spring breeze. In her cellar hideout, Greta Schmidt held her brothers close as they listened to the unmistakable sound of tank treads on the cobblestone streets above. Her mother had left at dawn to help at the emergency hospital and had not returned. The children had been alone for hours, subsisting on a small piece of bread and their dwindling supply of water. "Are those the monsters?" 6-year-old Karl whispered, his eyes wide. "Hush," Greta scolded gently. "They're just soldiers. Remember what Vater said? Soldiers are just men doing what they're told, no matter which side." But even as she reassured her brother, Greta felt her own heart racing. The Nazi propaganda images were burned into her mind. The grotesque caricatures of black soldiers coming to destroy German homes and families. Were those the men now walking above their hiding place? The sound of breaking glass upstairs made them all freeze. Heavy footsteps moved through their home. An American voice called out something incomprehensible. "Niemand here," shouted another voice, a German speaker with an American accent. "No one here." The footsteps receded. The Americans were checking houses for hidden soldiers or weapons, but their search of the Schmidt home had been cursory. Greta and her brothers remained huddled in their cellar as afternoon turned to evening. The sounds of occupation, vehicles, shouted orders, occasional gunfire, filtering down to them. As darkness fell, hunger became an urgent problem. They had finished the last of their bread hours ago, and Karl had begun to whimper softly about being hungry. Greta faced a difficult decision: remain hidden as her mother had instructed, or venture out to seek food for her brothers. "I'm going to look for something to eat," she finally whispered. "You two stay here. Heinrich, you're in charge until I return." "But Mutti said—" Heinrich began to protest. "Mutti would want us to have food," Greta countered, with more confidence than she felt. "I'll be very careful." Cautiously, she crept up the cellar stairs and peered into their kitchen. The house was dark and appeared empty, though she could see through the partially curtained window that the street outside was lit by the headlights of military vehicles. American soldiers stood at what appeared to be a checkpoint at the end of their block. The kitchen cupboards had already been nearly bare, but Greta searched desperately for anything overlooked. Behind a stack of plates, she found a small forgotten jar of preserved plums her mother had made the previous summer. It wasn't much, but it would help. As she reached for the jar, a floorboard creaked behind her. Greta froze, then slowly turned around. A tall figure stood in the kitchen doorway. In the dim light filtering through the window, she could make out an American uniform and, as her eyes adjusted, the dark face of a black soldier. He was younger than she'd expected, not much older than their neighbor Fritz, who'd been drafted at 18, and he looked nothing like the monstrous caricatures from the propaganda. He looked tired, human. The soldier seemed as startled to find her as she was to see him. His rifle was slung over his shoulder, not pointed at her. After a moment of tense silence, he spoke in heavily accented German. "Kinda. Allein? Child? Alone?" Greta nodded cautiously, clutching the jar of plums to her chest. The soldier reached slowly into his pocket and Greta tensed. But what he withdrew wasn't a weapon. It was a chocolate bar. He held it out to her, then gestured to his mouth and made an eating motion. "Food," he said in English, then attempted the German Essen. Greta stared at the chocolate, torn between hunger and suspicion. The soldier, seeming to understand her hesitation, unwrapped one corner of the bar, broke off a small piece, and ate it himself to show it was safe. Then he rewrapped it and held it out again. Cautiously, Greta reached out and took the chocolate. "Danke," she whispered. The soldier nodded, then spoke into a radio on his shoulder. Greta couldn't understand his words, but his tone didn't sound threatening. After a brief exchange, he pointed to himself. "James," he said clearly. "Greta," she replied reflexively. "Greta," he repeated, then pointed downward with a questioning look. She realized he was asking if there were others. After a moment's hesitation, she nodded. "Brüder," she said, "brothers." Understanding dawned in his eyes. He held up 2 fingers questioningly. "Ja, zwei," Greta confirmed. 2 brothers. The soldier, James, nodded again, then reached into his pack and pulled out 2 more chocolate bars. He handed them to Greta, then made a gesture indicating he would wait outside. Stunned by this unexpected kindness, Greta hurried back to the cellar. Her brothers looked up hopefully as she returned with the preserved plums and, more remarkably, the chocolate bars. "Where did you get those?" Heinrich asked suspiciously. "An American soldier gave them to me," Greta admitted. "A black soldier." Her brother's eyes widened in fear. "One of the devils," Karl whispered. "No," Greta said firmly. "He's not a devil. He's just a man named James, and he's waiting outside to help us." Back at the American command post established in Eisenach's partially damaged post office, Staff Sergeant Wilson reported his encounter to Lieutenant Peterson. "3 kids, sir, alone in a house on Goethestrasse. 2 boys, 1 girl. Oldest can't be more than 12 or 13. Looks like they haven't eaten properly in weeks." Peterson nodded grimly. They'd encountered similar situations in other recently captured German towns, civilians hiding in cellars, children separated from parents, the elderly abandoned in the chaos of the Nazi regime's collapse. "Did they say where their parents are?" "My German isn't good enough for details, sir." But the girl indicated something about their mother at the hospital. Father likely in the Wehrmacht. Peterson consulted a map spread out on what had once been the postmaster's desk. "The hospital should be here," he said, pointing to a building marked with a red cross. "The 71st's medics have established an aid station there. We can check if the mother's among the German medical staff they've kept on." Wilson hesitated, then asked, "Sir, what's the protocol here? We can't just leave those kids alone." "Technically, civilian affairs are supposed to be handed over to the military government units once they arrive," Peterson replied. "But that could be days in the meantime." He paused, considering. "Did you give them some rations?" "K rations and chocolate, sir. Not much, but better than nothing." Peterson nodded. "Good. For now, log the location and the children's situation. I'll inform Captain Reynolds about a civilian welfare concern. The 71st Civil Affairs officer can follow up tomorrow." He studied Wilson's face. "Is there something else, Sergeant?" Wilson shifted uncomfortably. "It's just the look on that girl's face, sir, when she first saw me. Pure terror, then confusion when I didn't match whatever nightmare they've been told about us." "Nazi propaganda," Peterson said simply. "They've been fed a steady diet of it for years." "I know, sir, but these are just kids, whatever their parents or teachers believed. They're innocent in all this." Peterson's expression softened slightly. "We're securing the town, not punishing children, Wilson. Do what you can for them within reason. Just remember, we're soldiers, not relief workers." "Understood, sir." As Wilson left the command post, he found Private Johnson waiting outside, smoking a cigarette with Corporal Davis. "How'd it go with the lieutenant?" Johnson asked. "Official response: log it and let Civil Affairs handle it tomorrow," Wilson replied, lighting a cigarette of his own. Davis snorted. "Those Civil Affairs boys won't get here for days, probably too busy denazifying some town 20 miles back. Which is why we're going to check on those kids again," Wilson said quietly, "and see if we can locate their mother." Johnson raised an eyebrow. "We got orders to do that?" "We got orders to secure the town and maintain order," Wilson replied. "Can't have hungry kids wandering the streets after curfew looking for food, can we?" Davis grinned. "Nope, definitely a security concern." Wilson gestured to their jeep. "Davis, you're driving. Johnson, grab some more rations from the supply truck. Whatever you can get without too many questions." As they prepared to return to the Schmidt home, an elderly German man approached them hesitantly, cap in hand. He spoke rapidly in German, pointing toward a nearby street. "Whoa, slow down, Pop," Davis said. "Sprechen Sie English?" The man shook his head, then tried again more slowly, gesturing emphatically. "I think he's trying to tell us about someone who needs help," Wilson said. "Johnson, go find that interpreter. What's his name? Müller?" "Klein," Johnson corrected. "The German Jewish guy who escaped in '38. While Johnson fetched the interpreter, Wilson tried to communicate with the elderly German using hand gestures. The man seemed increasingly agitated, pointing repeatedly at his wrist, as if indicating time was important. Corporal Klein arrived a few minutes later, slightly out of breath. After a brief conversation in German, he turned to Wilson. "He says there's a woman in labor in a basement 2 streets over. No doctor, no midwife. He's been trying to find help for hours." Wilson made a quick decision. "Davis, change of plans. Tell the medical station we need assistance at—" He looked to Klein for the address. "Lutherstrasse 8, Klein provided. "Johnson, continue with getting those supplies to the Schmidt kids. I'll go with Davis and Klein to check on this woman." As they split up on their separate missions of mercy, none of them noticed the small group of German civilians watching from a distance. Their expressions, a mixture of fear, curiosity, and growing confusion as they observed the black American soldiers rushing to help German citizens rather than harming them. By the second day of the American occupation of Eisenach, word began to spread through whispered conversations and furtive exchanges between neighbors. The Schwarze Teufel were not the monsters they had been led to believe. Instead, children were receiving chocolate and K-rations from smiling soldiers with dark skin. The wounded were being treated alongside American casualties at the field hospital, and even pets were being fed scraps from mess kits. For Hauptmann Werner Kluge, hiding in a farmer's hayloft on the outskirts of town, this news was both baffling and enraging. Having slipped out of Eisenach just before the American arrival, disguising himself as a civilian, he had planned to make contact with other Wehrmacht stragglers and continue resistance. But as he cautiously ventured into town to assess the situation, what he found contradicted everything the Nazi propaganda had promised. "It cannot be true," he muttered to himself, as he watched from the shadows of an alley as a group of German children eagerly accepted chewing gum from a black American soldier. "It's a trick to lower our guard." But the evidence of his own eyes was becoming harder to deny. The Americans had established order quickly, were providing medical care, and even beginning to distribute food aid. The dreaded retribution against the civilian population had not materialized. Most confusingly to Kluge, it was the black soldiers, those the propaganda had portrayed as barely human savages, who seemed most often to be interacting positively with German civilians, especially children. At the Schmidt household, a remarkable transformation was underway. Private Marcus Johnson had returned not only with additional rations, but with news that their mother had been located. Katharina Schmidt was indeed working at the emergency hospital, having been prevented from returning home by the fighting and subsequent curfew. Johnson had left a message that her children were safe, and she had sent word that she would return as soon as her shift ended. In the meantime, Johnson had been joined by several other members of the 761st, including the tank's driver, Corporal Henry Davis. They had brought not only food, but also medical supplies, as Heinrich had developed a persistent cough that concerned Greta. "It's probably just a cold," Davis said after listening to the boy's chest with a field medic's basic training. "But we'll have one of our doctors check him tomorrow to be sure." The initial terror the children had felt upon seeing black soldiers had completely dissolved. Carl, the youngest, had even fallen asleep against Johnson's shoulder as the private told a sanitized version of his childhood in Louisiana, translated haltingly through Greta's school English and a small German-English dictionary one of the soldiers carried. "You have alligators where you live?" Heinrich asked incredulously, momentarily forgetting his cough. Johnson grinned as he waited for Greta to translate. "Big ones," he confirmed, holding his arms wide. "My uncle wrestled one once." This required multiple attempts at translation before the children understood, their eyes widening at the exotic tale. "Tell them about New Orleans," Davis suggested, enjoying the impromptu cultural exchange. As Johnson described Mardi Gras parades and jazz music, concepts entirely foreign to the German children, Greta studied these men who had been portrayed as demons in human form. They were young. Davis couldn't be much older than 25, Johnson perhaps younger, and they spoke of homes and families thousands of miles away. They showed her brothers the same patience and kindness she might expect from an uncle or family friend. The contradiction between what she had been taught and what she was experiencing created a profound cognitive dissonance. "Why are you being so nice to us?" she finally asked during a lull in the conversation. The posters said you would." She trailed off, embarrassed by what she had been taught to believe. Davis seemed to understand what she couldn't articulate. "We know what they told you about us," he said quietly. "But see, that's why we're fighting this war. Because judging folks by what they look like instead of who they are, that's what we're trying to stop." When Greta translated this for her brothers, Heinrich frowned thoughtfully. "But you're American. Why do you fight for them when they have, what did you call it? Jim Crow?" Davis and Johnson exchanged glances, surprised by the perceptiveness of the question. "That's complicated," Johnson said after a moment. "We're fighting for what America should be, not always what it is. And we're fighting against what the Nazis definitely are." Before Greta could translate, there was a commotion at the front door. Katharina Schmidt rushed in, her face a mask of panic that transformed into shock as she took in the scene. Her children safely eating American rations in the company of black U.S. soldiers. "Mutti!" Carl cried, running to embrace his mother. Katharina gathered her youngest son in her arms, her eyes never leaving the American soldiers. Her expression was unreadable, a complex mixture of relief, confusion, and lingering fear. "They brought us food, Mutti," Greta explained quickly. "And they're going to have a doctor check Heinrich's cough." Katharina stood frozen for a moment, then slowly inclined her head. "Danke," she said formally. "Thank you for caring for my children." As Davis and Johnson prepared to leave, giving the family privacy for their reunion, Katharina stopped them with another question, her English halting but understandable. "Why you help German children? After what Germany did?" Johnson looked to Davis, who answered carefully, "Ma'am, we've seen enough hungry kids in this war. French kids, Belgian kids, German kids. They all look the same to us. Just children who didn't ask for any of this." After the Americans left, Katharina sat at the kitchen table with her children, listening in stunned silence as they eagerly recounted everything they had learned about their new friends. Johnson's alligator stories, Davis's description of Harlem, the promises of a doctor's visit, and more food tomorrow. "They're nothing like the posters, Mutti," Heinrich said between spoonfuls of the bean soup the soldiers had helped prepare. "They taught us a game called baseball. And Corporal Davis has 3 little sisters at home," Karl added. "He showed us their picture." Katerina watched her children, seeing the animation in their faces that had been absent for so long. The war had gradually drained the childhood from them. The constant fear, the hunger, the bomb shelters, the loss of their father to the Eastern Front. Now, improbably, it was the enemy, the very soldiers they had been taught to fear most, who had restored a small piece of that childhood in the midst of Germany's defeat. "Greta," she said quietly, "what else did they tell you?" Greta hesitated, sensing the deeper question behind her mother's words. They said that judging people by how they look instead of who they are is what they're fighting against. That's why they're here." Katerina closed her eyes briefly. "Your father said something similar once, before everything changed." That night, as her children slept better than they had in months, their stomachs full for the first time in weeks, Katerina Schmidt sat alone by the window, watching American patrols pass by on the street below. She thought of her husband, from whom she had not heard in months, and of the gradual transformation that had overcome Germany during the Nazi years. How casual prejudices had hardened into state doctrine, how neighbors had turned against neighbors, how the world had been divided into a simplistic hierarchy of human worth, and now those ideologies lay shattered, exposed as hollow falsehoods by the simple kindness of men who, according to everything she had been taught, should have been incapable of such humanity. Elsewhere in Eisenach that night, different scenes were unfolding that would accelerate the transformation of the town's perception. At the field hospital, American medical personnel worked alongside German doctors and nurses to treat all casualties regardless of nationality. Captain Robert Freeman, one of the few black physicians in the U.S. Army, supervised treatment of German civilians with the same care he showed his own soldiers. "Scalpel?" he requested, his voice calm despite the chaotic surroundings as he prepared to remove shrapnel from an elderly German man's leg. The German nurse assisting him hesitated almost imperceptibly before handing him the instrument. It was the first surgery she had assisted with a black doctor, and despite her professional training, the years of propaganda had left their mark. Freeman noticed her hesitation, but chose to address it directly, his German limited but effective. "Fräulein, I trained at Howard University. I have performed this procedure many times. Your patient is in good hands." The nurse flushed with embarrassment, nodding quickly. By the end of the complex 2-hour surgery, her initial uncertainty had been replaced by professional respect as she observed Freeman's skill and precision. Similar scenes played out across Eisenach. At a damaged water main, engineers from the 761st Tank Battalion worked alongside German municipal workers to restore clean water to a residential district. At the town's bakery, American supply officers arranged for the delivery of flour, so bread production could resume for civilians, and perhaps most symbolically, in the town square where Nazi rallies had once been held, an impromptu baseball game developed between American soldiers and German children, the universal language of play-bridging divides that propaganda had insisted were unbridgeable. For Hauptmann Werner Kluge, watching these developments from the shadows, it was a profound ideological crisis. The racial hierarchies that had been central to Nazi doctrine were being disproven before his eyes. The Schwarze Teufel were revealing themselves to be ordinary men, some kind, some stern, some weary from combat, but all recognizably, undeniably human. On the 3rd day of occupation, the emotional dam broke. Word had spread through Eisenach about the Americans' generosity with food and medical care. As a supply convoy arrived at the town center to establish a formal aid distribution point, something extraordinary happened. Rather than hiding from the arriving trucks, German children began to emerge from side streets, tentatively at first, then with growing confidence. Among them were Greta, Heinrich, and Karl Schmidt, accompanied by their mother, who had given permission for this expedition after her own transformative experiences at the hospital. As they waited in line for the distribution to begin, Greta spotted a familiar face. Private Johnson was helping to unload supplies from one of the trucks. When he saw the Schmidt children, his face broke into a broad smile and he waved them over. "Hey, look who's here," he called to his comrades. "The baseball team." This English phrase had become familiar to the German children, who giggled in response. Johnson jumped down from the truck and approached, producing a small paper bag from his pocket. "Special delivery," he said with a wink to Greta, who translated for her brothers. Inside were 3 small chocolate bars, treasured luxuries that had been all but unavailable to German civilians for years. Katharina Schmidt began to protest that it was too generous, but Johnson waved away her concerns. "Ma'am, these kids made my buddy Davis smile for the first time since we lost Thompson at the Rhine crossing. That's worth more than chocolate." As this exchange took place, other German parents and children watched with a mixture of amazement and dawning hope. The sight of the Schmidt family comfortably interacting with Black American soldiers, the very embodiment of what they had been taught to fear most, created a powerful cognitive breakthrough. A small girl, perhaps 4 years old, suddenly broke away from her mother and ran directly towards Staff Sergeant Wilson, who was supervising the supply distribution. Her mother called after her in alarm, but the child reached Wilson before anyone could intervene. "Chocolate?" the little girl asked simply, looking up at the tall soldier with expectant eyes unclouded by learned prejudice. Wilson knelt down to her level, his expression softening. He'd been carrying a chocolate bar in his breast pocket, saving it for later. Now he unwrapped it and broke off a piece, offering it to the child with a gentle smile. "Here you go, little one," he said in English, though his tone conveyed his meaning clearly enough. The girl accepted the chocolate with a beaming smile and a polite "Danke schön," then turned and ran back to her mother, proudly displaying her treasure. It was a pivotal moment witnessed by dozens of Eisenach residents. A threshold had been crossed. Within minutes, other children began to approach the American soldiers, shyly at first, then with growing boldness. The adults hung back, still processing this radical contradiction of everything they had been taught, but their children had no such hesitation. By midday, the scene in the town square had transformed completely. Where just days earlier, Nazi officials had warned of the savage barbarity of the advancing American forces, now German children played catch with black GIs, received medical checkups from black medics, and sat on the fenders of Sherman tanks as soldiers patiently taught them English phrases. For Staff Sergeant Wilson, watching this transformation from his position by the supply trucks, the experience was profoundly moving. A German boy of about 10 was proudly wearing his helmet, comically oversized on the child's head, while another soldier showed a group of children how to operate a harmonica. Lieutenant Peterson approached, surveying the scene with a bemused expression. "Not exactly what the training manual prescribed for occupying enemy territory, is it, Sergeant?" Wilson shook his head. "No, sir. Definitely not in any field manual I've read." "Captain Reynolds is concerned we're getting too friendly with the locals," Peterson said, though his tone suggested he didn't entirely share this concern. "Fraternization with the enemy and all that." "With respect, sir, I don't see any enemy here," Wilson replied, gesturing to the children. "Just kids who've been fed lies their whole lives, finally seeing the truth." Peterson nodded slowly. "That may be the most important victory we win in this war, Wilson. Not the territory, not the military objectives, showing them that everything they were taught about people who look like you and me was a lie." He paused, then added more quietly, "Wish we could achieve the same breakthrough back home sometimes." The irony wasn't lost on either of them. Black American soldiers demonstrating the falsehood of Nazi racial ideology while their own country still enforced segregation. From his hiding place in an abandoned shop overlooking the square, Hauptmann Werner Kluge watched this scene with mounting inner turmoil. As a Wehrmacht officer, he had been thoroughly indoctrinated in Nazi racial theories. He had commanded men who had committed atrocities in Poland and Russia based on those beliefs. He had accepted without question the propaganda about the Schwarze Teufel, who would destroy German civilization. Yet the evidence before him was undeniable. These soldiers, men he had been taught were subhuman, were showing more humanity to German civilians, even German children, than many of his own comrades had shown to civilians in occupied territories. The contradiction was shattering the foundations of everything he had been led to believe. As he watched, a familiar figure entered the square, Frau Schmidt and her children, whom he recognized from his time as the local military liaison before being sent to the front. The children were laughing, actually laughing, as they received food packages from American soldiers. The sound of German children's laughter, which had become so rare in the final years of the war, struck him with unexpected emotional force. In that moment, something broke inside Hauptmann Werner Kluge. The elaborate structure of racial hatred and fear that had been constructed through years of Nazi indoctrination collapsed under the simple weight of observed reality. These men were not devils. They were human beings showing kindness to innocent children, regardless of nationality. A universal human instinct that transcended the artificial barriers of propaganda. With trembling hands, Kluge removed his officer's cap and the civilian jacket he had used for disguise. Slowly, deliberately, he stepped out of the shadows and into the sunlight of the town square. Several German civilians noticed him immediately, recognizing the former military commander who had enforced harsh discipline in the town during the war's final months. A hush fell over the nearest group as Kluge walked with stiff military bearing directly toward Staff Sergeant Wilson. American soldiers tensed, hands moving toward weapons, as they noted the German's approach and the reaction of the locals. Wilson turned to face the approaching German, his expression cautious but composed. He had encountered surrendering officers before, but something about this man's demeanor suggested a different purpose. Kluge stopped precisely 3 paces from Wilson, drew himself up to attention, and extended his hand, not in the Nazi salute but in the universal gesture of one man greeting another. "I am Hauptmann Werner Kluge, Wehrmacht," he said in heavily accented but clear English. "I have seen enough. The war is lost. The ideology is wrong. I surrender myself to you." For a brief moment, the two men, the black American sergeant and the German officer, stood facing each other, embodying the collision of 2 worlds and 2 sets of beliefs. Then Wilson slowly extended his own hand and clasped Kluge's firmly. "Staff Sergeant James Wilson, United States Army," he replied simply. Around them, German civilians watched in stunned silence. For many, seeing their former military commander, a man who had publicly supported Nazi racial doctrines, shake hands with a black American soldier was the final, irrefutable evidence that everything they had been taught about racial hierarchies was false. If even Hauptmann Kluge could acknowledge this truth, how could they continue to cling to the lies? In the days that followed, a remarkable transformation swept through Eisenach. German children began to run toward, not away from, the black American soldiers who had been demonized as devils. They gathered eagerly around Sherman tanks, begging for rides or just to peek inside. They followed medical corpsmen like ducklings carrying bandages and supplies. They taught American soldiers German words and learned English phrases in return. For Staff Sergeant Wilson and the men of the 761st Tank Battalion, this transformation represented a victory more profound than any military objective. They had not just captured a town, they had liberated minds from the prison of hatred and fear. 1 week after the Americans arrived in Eisenach, a small ceremony took place in the town square. The 761st Battalion was preparing to move eastward, continuing the advance into German territory. Before they departed, the residents of Eisenach gathered to say goodbye to the men who had upended their understanding of humanity. Greta Schmidt, now appointed as an unofficial translator due to her growing English skills, stood beside Lieutenant Peterson as he addressed the assembled townspeople. "We came as soldiers," Peterson said, pausing to allow Greta to translate. "We leave as proof that what divides us is less important than what unites us. Remember this lesson when others try to tell you who to fear and who to hate." As the tanks prepared to depart, German children ran alongside, waving and calling out the names of soldiers they had come to know. Parents who just days earlier had hidden their families in fear now stood openly in the streets, some offering small tokens of appreciation, hand-carved wooden figures, embroidered handkerchiefs, pressed wildflowers. For Private Marcus Johnson, the youngest member of Wilson's crew, this experience had been transformative. As they mounted their tank for departure, he turned to his sergeant with a thoughtful expression. "You know what gets me, Sarge?" Back home, there are places these same kids could sit at a lunch counter where I couldn't. Makes no kind of sense. Wilson nodded grimly. That's why this war isn't over when Germany surrenders, Johnson. We've got another fight waiting back home. But if we can change minds here, in Nazi Germany of all places, then maybe there's hope for Mississippi. Wilson finished with a wry smile. Maybe so. One mind at a time. As the tanks of the 761st rumbled out of Eisenach, continuing their historic push across Germany, they left behind not just a town freed from Nazi control, but a population liberated from the chains of racial hatred. The Schwarze Teufel had revealed themselves to be not devils at all, but men of uncommon compassion and humanity who had defeated not just a military enemy, but the more insidious enemy of manufactured hatred. Greta Schmidt watched them go with mixed emotions. In just 1 week, these men had shattered a worldview that had been constructed through years of careful propaganda. They had shown her family kindness when they most needed it. They had restored her faith in the possibility of human connection across the artificial barriers of nationality and race. As the last tank disappeared around a bend in the road, Carl tugged at his sister's sleeve. "Will they come back?" he asked hopefully. "I don't know," Greta answered honestly, "but we'll remember them, and what they taught us." Her mother, standing beside them, placed a hand on each child's shoulder. "We will remember," she agreed softly, "and we will tell others the truth." In the months and years that followed, as Germany painfully rebuilt from the ashes of defeat and confronted the horrors of the Nazi regime, the story of the black American soldiers who had shown kindness to German children became a powerful counter-narrative to the racial hatred that had fueled the Third Reich. In Eisenach and other towns where the 761st had passed, families shared their experiences, gradually helping to dismantle the racist ideologies that had been systematically instilled. For the men of the 761st Tank Battalion, their experiences in Germany became a painful contrast to their return to a still segregated America. Staff Sergeant Wilson, arriving home to Harlem in late 1945, was denied service at a restaurant while still in uniform, just blocks from where he was welcomed as a returning hero. Yet the seeds of change had been planted on both sides of the Atlantic. The experiences of black soldiers abroad and their treatment upon return helped fuel the nascent civil rights movement in America. In Germany, the direct experience of encountering those they had been taught to hate played a crucial role in the denazification process. In 1965, nearly 20 years after the war, Greta Schmidt, now Dr. Greta Meyer, a history professor at the University of Jena, welcomed a special visitor to her classroom. Staff Sergeant James Wilson, his hair now streaked with grey, had returned to Germany as part of a veterans delegation. As Wilson addressed the students, he spotted a familiar face in the back of the lecture hall, an elderly woman he recognized as Katharina Schmidt, now in her 70s, watching proudly as her daughter introduced the American veteran. "I want to tell you about a different kind of victory," Wilson began, looking out at the young German faces before him, students born long after the war for whom the Third Reich was already becoming distant history. Not the victory of armies or nations, but the victory that happens when human beings look past what they've been taught to fear and see each other's humanity instead. As he recounted the story of Eisenach in April 1945, of German children running toward, not away from, the soldiers their propaganda had called devils, he observed these students of a new generation absorbing its lesson. He saw in their attentive faces the most enduring victory of that long-ago war, the triumph of human connection over manufactured hatred. "The most dangerous weapon in any war," Wilson concluded, "is not found in an arsenal. It's the lie that tells you that some people are less human than others. Break that weapon, and lasting peace becomes possible." When he finished speaking, the first to rise for the standing ovation was Katharina Schmidt, tears streaming down her face as she applauded the man who had helped her family see beyond the lies they had been taught, the man who, in showing kindness to hungry German children at their moment of greatest vulnerability, had demonstrated the universal truth of our shared humanity. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.